So tonight's presentation is Remembering Frederick and Anna Douglass. And our presenter is Rose O'Keefe, who is the author of 6 nonfiction history books, which she will tell you more about in her presentation this evening. They're impressive. She's not only an author, but she's a blogger and a speaker as well. She's a member of the Rochester area Children's Writers and Illustrators, the Society of Children's Writers and Illustrators, and the Toastmasters International's Frederick Douglass Club, number 6898. Rose grew up outside of New York City and moved to Rochester after graduating from SUNY Potsdam. She became intrigued with the Douglass family's daily life in Rochester from 1847 to 1872. So without further ado, join us for our Black History Month presentation. That's why we try to plan these things this way, from Rose O'Keefe. Rose, welcome and take it away.
All right, I'm going to start by asking, I know I am so pleased. I know at least one person from history fairs that I did years ago, but how many of you have been down on Alexander Street near East Avenue, which is where this 3D mural is? Yeah, have you seen this, Drew? Yeah, no, all right. I'm going to say Alexander Street's a busy street, and if I weren't looking for it, I wouldn't necessarily stop either. But my point about this attractive mural is that it might show you something you didn't know anything about. You might be familiar with Frederick Douglass on the left, but not know that his wife is on the right, and their 5 children are shown. Most people have never heard of their 5 children, and current research has completely changed that, but it hasn't come out fully. We're expecting a bunch of research to come out later this year that'll tell everybody more than anybody ever knew about him. But in the years when I was doing my history fairs from 2005 to 2010, it was very hard to find out anything about her, and that didn't change much, or about the children. And that bothered me. It bothered me. Partly, I don't know, some of you know, I do live in the South Wedge, and at a certain point, I wondered if the house I live in was built in 1860, and I wondered if the family or the children, or if any of them had ever walked down the street past my house. I thought that was intriguing. Let's see. We know more about Frederick Douglass because he wrote about his childhood in his 2 autobiographies. He talked about growing up in the backwoods. It was his grandmother's cabin that was in a remote area that had a creek and a little well. He was one of an ever-changing group of children who were all taken care of by the grandmother while the mothers worked elsewhere, and most of them, it was far enough away that they could not visit their children. He seldom saw his own mother. But he described his early childhood, for the most part, when he wrote his autobiographies later, and he looked back at his childhood, he said the years in the backwoods were relatively carefree. And he would say he had a happy childhood. We don't know hardly anything. I'm waiting till later this year to find out what other people have found out about Anna. His name was Frederick Bailey. Her name was Anna Murray. She grew up in a nearby county. They're both from Eastern Shore. It has a culture and a way of life that made them familiars. What we do know about her is that she was one of 13 children, and for some reason not explained, her mother was manumitted, set free a month before Anna was born, and she was their first child born free. They would have lived in the country. They would have had all the country ways, and specifically a division of labor in which there was men's work and women's work. And Anna would have known all the ways of country women. You want candles, you make them. You want clothes, you sew them. You want tools, somebody would make it. Everything would be hand done the old fashioned way that some people find attractive now, but it's slow and labor intensive. But she was totally trained in rural country ways. They both ended up going to Baltimore for different reasons. He is a slave boy. He is required to work. And it wasn't clear when he moved from the relative quiet of the backwoods at his grandmother's cabin to his master's house. He did, little odd jobs, but it wasn't decided. Would he be a house slave, a field slave, whatever? And before that decision was made, he ended up being sent to Baltimore, and that changed his life completely. He traveled on a commercial boat full of sheep that was going to Baltimore for slaughter, and he's delivered to a shipping neighborhood in Baltimore, and he is to be the live-in babysitter for his master's brother's wife, who had a 2-year-old and another one on the way. So he's basically there to take care of this little kid, and the woman of the house was not an experienced slave owner, so she didn't treat him differently from somebody in her extended family. And they did have what you might call a little honeymoon time, where she loved him. He had, for the first time in his life, he wore clothes, as in real clothes. He had a little bed with a mattress and a blanket and a small little closet that was his own sleep space. He ate dinner with them at their kitchen table. The honeymoon sweet days lasted for a bit and then ended because the husband insisted she not treat him like her own. And it soured everything after that. But in the meantime, he becomes familiar with city living, which 100% sets him apart from all the family back on the plantation. Anna came to Baltimore later. Like a lot of people, she would have left the country to move to the city for work. She did that as a teenager, around 15, 16. And as would have been typical of the time, she did domestic work. And she had a little learning curve, I'm sure, learning to shed her country ways. And by the time she did a few years with one family and 7 years with another family, and became a prized, valuable live-in domestic and cook. She was a phenomenal Southern cook. And I still just read someplace, that she wouldn't have known the ways of middle class people. Yes, she would. She would completely have known them from the other side of the table. She would never have sat down with these middle class families and their guests, but she knew how to serve them and have proper decorum. And some people described her later in life as stern. Neither Freddie Bailey or Anna Murray had the right to any privacy of any kind while they were live-in workers for other people. And she learned to maintain a calm face no matter what was going on. It's not clear how they met in Baltimore, but they did. The community they were in, the Fells Point neighborhood, was small. They could have met at church, at the market, in a shop, on the street. And the other thing is, it always ticks me off how people made such a big deal of Hannah being uneducated. She played the fiddle. She introduced him to playing the violin. He started getting violin lessons in Baltimore, in that neighborhood. And from that time, they started collecting sheet music, and they did that for the rest of their life. Now, he went on to become an impressive amateur violinist, and can't say that about her, but I certainly don't know. But it was one of their joys in life to play the violin together. They played duets. That is such a stereotype busting impression. I'm trying not to dwell too much on it, but she has been minimized for so much of history. And today is my day to toot her horn. They met at a certain point. Freddie had a pretty rough time. At a certain point in Baltimore, he got too feisty. He was sent back to the plantation, worked in the cotton field, very harsh time there, comes back to Baltimore, and he becomes a skilled caulker. That's the men who seal the seams on the boats. It's skilled work. He was a competent worker, and he was very well paid, better paid than most people, but he had the aggravation of having to give everything he earned every week to his owner, who would give him a little allowance. He hated that and wanted out of there. And the owner said, well, if you behave, I'll set you free at age 25. He didn't buy it. It's most likely a lie anyway. But the truth is, if he were doing any kind of hard work, the question of whether he would survive to 25 is debatable. And anyway, he meets her. They plan. By definition, anything they did on the Underground Railroad had to have utmost secrecy. He makes his plan. She helps him. He goes to New York City, gets there, sends her a letter. She joins him, and they get married. And having seen the fancy parties and celebrations and all the interiors of the master's homes, at one point in his childhood, he had looked in his master's home and he said, that's what I want. He wanted that. And when they got to New York, he got the respectability and the status that he wanted. They were legally married by a minister, and his marriage certificate was one of his most prized possessions. In New York, the Underground Railroad master David Ruckles sends them to New Bedford. It's a shipping city, it's a port where he should be able to get the same kind of work that he was already doing. Well, it didn't work out that way, because even though Massachusetts is a free state, the ship owner said, if we hire you, all our white workers are walking off. So he ended up doing menial work. She worked briefly as a domestic, but first in New Bedford, they stayed with a couple whose last name was Johnson. He had chosen Johnson as his new fake name in New York City, and the Johnsons say, "Nay, pick another name." And that's when he chose Douglas, and they became Frederick and Anna Douglas. In the beginning, Anna might have visited churches with him, but in Baltimore, he had spent many, many, many hours in black churches, soaking up that rich tradition of, you know, hour-long speeches and sermons. And gradually in New Bedford, he attends a particular black church. And if anybody heard of Reverend Thomas James? Thomas James says to him, and maybe we'll hear a few words from our brother, newly freed from bondage. And very slowly, Douglas starts speaking up, and eventually he speaks up more. And then in the early 1840s, he gives his first major, major, off the charts public speech at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. And from that time, the Anti-Slavery Society says to him, "Do you want to work for us?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm not sure I can handle it." And he goes, "Oh, yes, you can." And he agrees to a 3-month trial. Little does he know how much less black speakers are paid than white speakers for the Anti-Slavery Society. But he starts where he starts. And that's when he begins living out
Yeah.
that public career, fully in sync with the man's work is outside the home and the woman's job is in the home, and she should be completely anonymous in public. There are only 2 times when women's names were in the paper: when they married and when they died. And he started to get fame, and he agreed to do this 100 conventions in a year. The Anti-Slavery Society aimed to reach out to 100 different places, and he did. And in those days, you could put a notice in a paper, it could get to a certain community. Maybe they got paper, maybe they didn't. Maybe they arranged a place, maybe they didn't. Maybe they gave him a place to stay, maybe they didn't. Maybe they gave him a meal, and maybe they didn't. He dealt with everything as a speaker for the Anti-Slavery Society on the road, leaving Anna at home where she belonged. And he had a very hard time, as he did more speaking, traveling with a white Quaker woman who was an anti-slavery speaker. He had to adjust his attitudes about women speaking in public, but he did. Douglas has been called an early adopter by people. And one of the things he did is that he started traveling all over the place. New Bedford was in the process of becoming the wealthiest city in the country because of its location between Boston and New York City and all the trade that went back and forth. And he was on the train all the time from New Bedford or Lynn, wherever they lived, into Boston. And from there, he started traveling to Albany, Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, and into Pennsylvania and Ohio. It was a grueling and exhilarating way of life. And he did it courageously. And when he came to Rochester, he had such a great reception here that he remembered it fondly. But one of the things that happened as he's going out on these talks, eventually people said to him, "Oh, wait, you could have never been a slave. You speak too well. You read. It doesn't, we don't believe it." And only once after one of his early speeches did he go after the talk and remove his jacket and show the scars on his back from the beatings and whippings he had gotten in the field as a teenager. He never needed to prove that to anybody, but people were, how can you believe him? How can you believe he's real, for real? And what he did is one winter he wrote his autobiography. And in it, he named names and places, acutely dangerous. But he did it, and he launched his new book at the Anti-Slavery Society's annual convention in New York City in the spring. It's a big event, and he announced it there. And he still went around lecturing that spring and summer as if he weren't in more danger than ever for having named names. And the Anti-Slavery Society sent him on a tour. They had a lot of connections in England, Ireland, and Scotland. And he went over there and toured for 22 months. And while he's over there, he can go on any public transportation, go into restaurants, go to hotels. He stays in middle and upper middle class homes. He does not experience the kind of insults and Jim Crow that was part of his daily life in the United States. And people in Great Britain arranged to buy his freedom. They also encouraged Anna to come over with the children and live there, and she didn't want to do that. But they also gave him money to start a newspaper. They said, you have got to do a newspaper. Well, he comes back to Boston. He's a changed man. He's got confidence, competence, people who like him, love him, adore him, and give him money. And they say, oh my gosh, you're too big for your britches now. And they fire him. Well, that's not a huge problem. He does go back on the lecture circuit for the season. And at the end of it, he decides that he will move to Rochester to start his newspaper. And when he comes here, he's first alone, and he goes back to they're in Lynn, and he goes back to Eastern Massachusetts and brings Anna and the boys with him. Their daughter Rosetta stayed in Albany with two white Quaker sisters who taught her everything that Frederick and Anna would have given anything to have. The schooling, the learning, the middle class skills. They taught her everything that a proper middle class girl would need to know. And they come here, and eventually they move to a house on South Avenue that's now across from Highland Hospital. And that's the location. And again, he's on the road. If you read the conventional biographies, they say Rochester became a major stop on the Underground Railroad once he showed up. Well, he starts this newspaper, and if you know the newspaper business, how's it changed in the last few years? It was rough. He was back on the road nonstop to support the newspaper, and Anna is home, not only taking care of the children. They took in boarders, they had renters. Anybody who needed a place stayed there. She was working behind the scenes, and if anybody got help on the Underground Railroad at the Douglas homes in Rochester, it was most likely from Anna and the children. Their life here, they were on Alexander and South Avenue 25 years, and that came to an end in June of 1872. Douglas believed it at the time. People screamed it at the time. It was arson. It was not. One researcher went to the police department and looked up their records. It showed that this fire that started in a barn on their property was an accident. And but the barn was full of dry hay. It went up in flames. They did have time to get some things out of the house, but the house was destroyed. They had by then 6 acres with orchards. They were able to save something, but basically the property was no longer livable, and they moved to D.C., where he had been um, working all along. By 1872, the family's life had completely changed because when they first moved to Rochester, Anna and the 3 boys came later. Rosetta joined them at the end of the summer, and their 5th child, Annie, was born on Alexander Street. But Annie, unfortunately, had a short life because of John Brown. John Brown had visited the family more than once. When he attacked Harper's Ferry and was arrested, her father had to flee for his life. There are people who would have lynched Douglas just for having written letters to John Brown. And when John Brown was hung and her father has fled the country, this little girl was distraught and basically had a nervous breakdown and died shortly, when she was 10, in March of 1860. The whole John Brown episode shattered this family's life terribly. Anna never got over it. One of the boys later said we were never all together again after that. The boys were older and living other places. But I learned most of what I learned about the family from this book in 2001. It gave me what I wanted. It described them as real people, and it showed them as a loving family. And I'm deeply indebted to Marion White for writing that book. But their second home is south of the Erie Canal. You can see the blue stripe on the right side. And again, he's on the road. She's managing everything. And even so, they're 25 years in Rochester. For those of you who remember those 25 years when you were raising your kids, you know, there were illnesses and accidents and all kinds of problems. But those years they're very rich. And Douglas always felt more at home here than any place else. And a lot of that had to do with all the work that Anna did to make a home that was open to all. And it came to an end in 72. They moved to D.C. He already had a home. I did not know that the Douglas family, Frederick and the boys, bought a lot of properties and became very wealthy through real estate, especially in the D.C. area. His job down there had been commission jobs, and eventually he got this job that had a regular paycheck. The man is in his 60s, and he finally gets a steady paycheck and buys this beautiful home at Cedar Hill. If you ever get there, definitely go. It looks over Capitol Hill. It's $1 million view. It's fantastic. And they're only there for just a few years. Anna had difficult health, and she had a stroke in the summer of 82 and finally died. And the boys are down there. Rosetta had moved down there, so they had kids, grandkids in and out of that house for several years while Anna was still alive. And the children 100% saw this as a family home. Well, if you know what Anacostia and Cedar Hill is like, this house is on a hill. Down the hill, up on the next hill, was a neighbor, and Helen Pitts' uncle owned that property, and she went there to stay with her uncle. She found work. She eventually got her own place. She got work in D.C. Making a living as a single woman was a hard thing, and she was a college-educated woman, but she lived very modestly. But she met Frederick at events at Cedar Hill, and he was really big into going to theater, and he liked concerts. And she and others, they would go to these events, and he got to know her. She ended up working in his office, and next thing you know, a year and a half after Anna's death, he marries Helen Pitt. They're friends. Most of them are accepting of it. Her father was not at all. Her mother and sister were okay, but the father would never visit D.C. when Douglas was in town. And I don't know exactly which point, but at some point, Douglas made up his will. And he specifically set it up that the property would go to this one. You want this, you get it. You want the family Bible, you get it. You want these possessions, you get it. It was all set up, but on a technicality that Helen did not have the required number of signatures for real estate in the will, she didn't get the house and had to remortgage it. She's no spring chicken. She's taken out a mortgage. She goes back on the lecture circuit to pay off the house, but the kids get their share of the money and the items that they had been told they would get. But over the years, after Frederick died, after Helen died, the children, none of them had great health. They die. All this possessions and memorabilia, as well as the Douglas family legacy, it all fades. And Helen, on her deathbed, had made friends promise that they would maintain Cedar Hill as the Douglas Memorial and Historical Association. It went through many ups and downs, was very run down by the time the National Park Service got it in 1962. And if you think of 1962, that's a time when civil rights, women's rights, voting rights, all those issues are coming to the fore. But it's years later, we're talking 2001, before Rochester acknowledges its own with Let's Have Tea, showing Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. That's a good beginning. Then in '05, the Rochester Freedom Trail Commission, some of you know Dr. David Anderson, that commission had been working for years to get this marker in front of 12th School on South Avenue, and it finally came out. And this city marker it had been on South Avenue up by Highland Bowl. I have pictures in front of mine. Let me see. It mentions him, what he did, and that he hid many fugitive slaves on this home site. So that's I'm just going to say, the old-fashioned perspective on Douglas as the famous one. My first book came out in 2005, and that's when I had my first history fair where I met some people. And then my second book came out in 2006. I had just a very few pictures and small captions on the Douglas family, because back in those days, it was hard to find anything. And then in 2006, this mural that I've been using parts of to illustrate this story came out. If you know Pembroke Street in the city, if you get off the expressway at Monroe Avenue and make a hairpin turn down Field Street and down onto Pembroke, In 2006, the Swilberg neighborhood commissioned these 5 massive murals, and this one is called Always Know Your Neighbor, and it shows Frederick out front. I'm assuming it's Anna in the background. The North Star is up on the left, and the Erie Canal along the Swilberg neighborhood is there. In 2007, the Douglas Anthony Bridge was dedicated, so public awareness has increased. My third book, Historic Genesee Country, mentions a little bit more about them. And finally, in 2013, I had enough information to write a whole book. And all of my books are designed for 6th grade and up. They are meant for general readers. My little soapbox is that I've read dozens of dense books, and I don't believe in passing that on to others. I want my information that I share to be readable. And next we have, in 2016, the Highland Branch Library that's across from Highland Hospital was renamed the Douglas Community Library, and it's got marvelous murals on it by Sean Dunwoody. 2018, all the statues go up around the city, 13 of them, to commemorate his 100th anniversary of his birthday. And if you can see the marker that's on the site of that mural, thank you, thank you, thank you. Frederick and Anna lived here with their children, and oops, go back. And they welcomed freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. That's the difference between 1984 and 2018. 12 School was renamed Anna Murray Douglas Academy in 2018. The children there are so phenomenally proud of her. The Douglas Airport, the airport was renamed for him in 21. My second edition of Special Deliveries, my only fiction history, came out in 21. And then, this is a special day. December 3rd is the date of the first issue of the North Star in the 1840s in Rochester. And this marvelous, phenomenal mural was unveiled at the airport. But if you go to, anybody been to I really can't see you, but if you've been to the Douglas site in Mount Hope Cemetery, which the Friends of Mount Hope have taken care of for decades, it's not clear. There's a small slab on the left, a big one, that's his. There's bare dirt on the right, and this thing on the back, you don't know who's there. Well, and then you wouldn't know. Mother is their daughter Rosetta. Father is their son-in-law Nathan. Hattie is one of the granddaughters. They had died in 1840. They had a lot of childhood mortality in the family. Aunt Lou is Rosetta's sister-in-law, and she and Lou took care of Anna for many years in Rochester as well as in Washington. But all of that changed in September of 2022 when the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative unveiled 2 new markers, a marvelous one for Anna and a marvelous one for Annie, making it completely clear. Oh my goodness, those 2 were buried to the left of his big slab, and people, myself included, have been stepping on them for years. So that corrected that. And then later in the fall, they updated the slab for Helen that's on the left, acknowledging her as the founder of the Frederick Douglass Historical and Memorial Association. I'm going to end my talk with this wonderful portrait. It's downstairs upstairs, I would say downtown, on the second floor of the public library on the way to local history. It was put up there in February of 2020 by a local artist. It says, "I will take to the water sanctified. I shall not be required to have a path." And in Helen's, what I'm assuming is a hard working hand, you have a symbol. This is Sankofa. It's an African symbol of a bird that nourishes its own by honoring the past. And with that, I will end this and take questions.
I was going to ask you about the mural. I hadn't seen those the beautiful murals downtown, but thank you for clarifying about that. I don't know where that one picture is in the airport. I've been to the airport many times. Do you know where that is in the airport?
Sure, it's a little tricky because you have to go up the stairs or the escalator, go to your right. If you know where the bathrooms and the elevators are on the right, you walk past them and make a left. And it's there, it's on the left side of that big observatory window.
Okay, thank
And
you.
it's spectacular.
Yeah. How did you get interested in the Douglases originally?
I'm gonna say I'm a slow learner. I've lived on Gregory Street since 1977. Both our children went to 12 school. Neither of them learned anything about the Douglases. And oh, I was looking up something. And when I was doing my research, I went to the Museum and Science Center. People know Lee Kemp. She showed me my mother as I recall her for the first time. I have my notes still. I read that in 2006. That's the most I learned about her. But I would go to local history because you couldn't take those books out. And I would bring a notepad and I would just sit there till my neck got stiff. And that's how I acquired these little bits of none of the information about the family was in the text. It was all in the footnotes. And I was like, wow, what a way to learn all this stuff. But one day somebody said to me, I don't know why people make such a fuss about Douglas. Thomas James was a better man. Oof, okay. But I gradually just got interested. And then one day, somehow I knew that they had moved from Alexander Street to South Avenue around 1852. And one day I just really wondered. I thought, anybody remember those dinky little pink plastic fake fur-lined boots that they sell as winter shoes for kids? My daughter had those, and I hated them. And one day, she walked home from school, and her feet are cold, and I just remember thinking, I bet you the Douglas kids had real wool socks and real leather shoes when they walked up and down the hill. And that's what got me started. And it took till 2013 to have enough to put a book out. But I always wanted to know, what was it like to live in that family with this famous dad who's never home. Never home. And they have people coming in and out all the time. And so I don't know if any of you have ever seen my little book, Special Delivery on the Underground Railroad. I wrote that because I wanted to show what it would have been like to be a kid in that family. As for books, I am happy to say I do my best not to do anything with carrying books around anymore. And I let Hippocampo Books on South Avenue, I tell people to go there. Hippocampo is a wonderful bookstore. They have all my books, but how many people prefer ebooks? My books are ebooks. I'm not fond of ebooks, but for those who like them, so be it. And I think all my books, I donate all my books to the Douglas Community Branch, but they're in the library, and you can get some of my books as ebooks through the library if you're so determined.
Rose, thank you again.
You're very welcome. Thanks
Good
for
night.
hosting me.
Good night. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.